Sunlight spilled across the quiet cul-de-sac as James Carter carried the last grocery bag. From the car, his wife Maya followed behind, balancing a carton of milk and smiling at the neighbor's dog chasing a butterfly. It was one of those mornings that made him believe the world was fine and predictable. The air smelled of wet grass and cinnamon from a bakery. A few streets over, and the faint sound of sprinklers danced through the silence. He set the bag on the driveway and said quietly, "This place almost feels like peace." She laughed, that small, soft laugh that always sounded like control and calm mixed together. Nothing ever shook Maya, not even the endless rules of the HOA that governed their perfect neighborhood. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the curb. Two uniformed officers stepped out, the first one Brent tall, broad shoulders, shaved head, mirrored shades. The other Colin, slower leaner with a face that liked to smirk before he spoke. Brent called out, "Morning, folks, we got a report of suspicious activity around here, mind telling us." "What you're doing?" James blinked, confused. "We live here, just unloading groceries." Brent circled the car, like a wolf sniffing prey. "Your name, Carter, right, Greg, from?" "The HOA said there was a complaint about improper parking." James looked at the driveway. The cars sat perfectly aligned in their own property line. Maya pulled a paper from her bag, the HOA parking approval signed and dated. She held it out, her voice calm and deliberate. "Everything's in order, officer." "Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." Brent ignored the paper. His eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. He stepped closer than necessary. The smell of his cologne sharp and artificial. He reached out under the excuse of checking the document. His hand brushed against her side. She froze for a fraction of a second. James saw the flicker in her eyes, a controlled rage beneath the stillness. He moved forward instinctively, but Maya caught his wrist, her touch firm. "Not now," her eyes said. "Not yet." Brent smirked. "Careful there, buddy. You don't want to make this worse." Greg appeared from behind patrol car, holding his clipboard like a trophy, his polo shirt tucked too tight over his belly. "Morning, Carter. Just making sure everyone's following the rules around here. You know how important order is in this community." James felt his throat tighten. His words came out dry and heavy. "We follow every rule, Greg. You made sure of that." Greg chuckled, that condescending sound that made James's fists itch. "It's good you understand your place around here. We're like good neighbors, the kind that cooperate." Brent scribbled something on his notepad, handed James a citation for obstructing community access. James stared at the absurd paper. It meant nothing, but the humiliation burned. Brent's eyes glinted under the sun as he adjusted his belt and said, "Maybe next time park inside your garage. Keeps things looking neat." They walked away, laughing, Collins murmuring something that made Brent bark out a cruel chuckle. James wanted to shout after them, wanted to tell the world what had just happened. But Maya stood there silent, her face unreadable. Only her hands trembled slightly around the grocery bag. She whispered, barely audible, "They have no idea who they just touched." He looked at her, then realization flickered, but she said nothing more. That night, the world outside looked too calm, too quiet. The saw from the streetlights felt mocking. James sat at the kitchen table, his hands pressed against his temples. Maya poured tea, her movements slow, deliberate, as if holding herself together through routine. "You should report them," he said, his voice sharp. She didn't look up. "Not yet," she said. "Why not?" "Because their arrogance is their shield, and I want them to think it still protects them." He looked at her eyes and saw something, their calculation. Control. She opened her laptop and began typing, her words clipped cold. He watched the glow of the screen dance across her face. He wanted to ask what she was doing, but something in her expression told him to wait. Finally, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Brent, Collins, and Greg." She said each name like a list of debts. "I'll make sure every one of them pays." James felt a chill crawl down his back. "Who are you planning to call?" She finally looked up, and her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before. "No calls." Yet she said, "This time we'll do it properly." Across the street, Greg's house lights flickered behind the blinds. A silhouette moved back and forth, pacing. Maybe watching, maybe waiting. James's heart drummed against his ribs. He didn't know what Maya was planning, but he knew one thing: the calm that had lived in their home all this time was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that hummed with purpose. He looked out through the window at the patrol car parked further down the road. Brent inside, half asleep, his presence a quiet threat. Maya stood beside James, her tea untouched, her voice a whisper that sliced the stillness. "They think power means never being caught." James turned to her. She met his eyes, steady, unwavering, and said softly, "We'll teach them what real power looks like." And for the first time since the morning, he believed her. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds when Maya stepped into her office, her posture straight, her expression carved from calm precision. The world outside buzzed with traffic and restless noise, but inside her glass-walled space silence ruled. She set her briefcase down and opened a folder thick with reports pages filled with names, numbers, and accusations, patterns of abuse tucked neatly behind bureaucratic language. Her reflection in the window looked composed, but the memory of Brent's smirk lingered in her mind like a bruise. She exhaled once, then began typing, her fingers steady, her thoughts sharp. She was not a wife anymore, not a neighbor, not a victim. She was a district attorney. And this was war. Across town, James tried to act normal, mowing the lawn, greeting neighbors, pretending the weight in his chest wasn't growing heavier. Greg's car slowed near their driveway. Again, the same condescending wave to the tinted glass. James forced a gnaw at his knuckles, whitening around the mower handle inside the house. The blinds quivered slightly at camera light, blinked once, then went dark. Maya had set it up herself without a word the previous night. James didn't ask questions anymore. He had seen the look in her eyes, the one that promised consequences. At the office, Maya summoned her investigator, a woman named Ortiz. Calm, focused eyes like a hawk. Ortiz listened quietly as Maya laid out the events, every word exact, every moment cataloged. Maya handed over documents that tied the two officers to multiple petty harassment reports, all dismissed without review. Ortiz nodded, slow, deliberate. "This isn't random," she said. "A pattern," Maya replied. "As a racket. They think intimidation is just another neighborhood service." By afternoon, Maya stood in the evidence room, cold metal shelves stacked with sealed boxes. She requested access to police body cam footage from the date of the incident. Brent's and Collins's files were conveniently marked under review. She smiled, faintly predictable. She murmured. She called in a favor from Internal Affairs, an untraceable request, a kind that whispered through the system. Without leaving fingerprints, she knew how to move inside. Power without being seen. She had done it her whole career. Back home, James found a letter taped at their front door, another HOA citation, vague accusations about unapproved trash bins and noise violations. Of pettiness almost felt personal now. He crumpled the paper and threw it in the bin. Maya read it and said nothing, her silence heavier than any curse. That night, she sat by the window, typing on her laptop. The glow reflected off her wedding ring, a symbol of promises, but now it looked like armor. James leaned against the doorframe and said quietly, "There. Going to push until we break." She didn't look up. She only said, "Let them, the further they go, the harder they'll fall." The next morning, James drove to work, but halfway down the street, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Officer Brent pulled him over. James gripped the wheel, forcing himself to stay calm. Brent leaned in, grinning. "Morning, neighbor license and registration." James handed them over. Brent scanned them slow, like he was savoring control. "You sure you're keeping things tidy around your place, Greg? Says you've been causing a fuss." James said nothing. Brent leaned closer, almost whispering, "Keep your wife's temper in check. She's been stepping on the wrong toes." James's blood turned to fire, but he swallowed it. Brent laughed, a low sound that slithered before walking back to his car. James sat there, breathing slow, until the lights disappeared. When he got home, Maya was already aware. She didn't ask how, she just said, "Did he touch you?" James shook his head, and she nodded, then whispered, "Good, they're losing patience, which means they'll slip soon." She opened a new folder labeled Operation Mirror. Inside it were notes, dates, and recordings, everything they'd gathered so far. 2 nights later, Maya parked outside the precinct under covered darkness. She wore plain clothes, hair tied back, face unreadable. She waited until Ortiz texted one word, "Ready," then walked inside like she belonged, which the night guard nodded at her, not realizing she was there for more than files. She accessed a restricted terminal. The screen glowed blue. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, her breath. Even she copied the logs of Brent and Collins's off-duty activities, a trail of HOA complaints that matched the payments Greg approved under discretionary funds. Back home, she transferred the files onto a drive and placed it in the safe. James asked, "When will you use it?" She smiled, "Soon, but not yet when the audience is big enough." The following day, Maya attended the HOA meeting unannounced. The room fell silent. As she entered, Greg blinked, visibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Carter," he started, but she interrupted softly. "Please, it's District Attorney Carter." Now his mouth opened, then closed. She walked to the table, placed a folder before him. "Your officer's friends have been quite busy," she said, her tone polite, "but deadly. I suggest you stop sending them to my house unless you want to be the next headline." Greg tried to laugh it off, his voice shaky. "Now, I don't know what you're talking about." Maya leaned forward, her gaze cutting through bravado. "You will," she said, then left the room, leaving the quiet hum of fear behind her. Heels clicked against the polished floor like a metronome counting down. That night, James watched her from the porch. As she looked up at the stars, her expression softer now. He asked what happens next. She said simply, "I let them think they've won. Tomorrow they'll come again, and when they do, we'll be ready." He looked at her and realized she wasn't preparing for survival. She was preparing for justice. And somewhere in the distance, a faint echo of a police siren reminded him that the game had already begun. The night arrived heavy with silence. The air outside felt thick, as though the street itself held its breath. James sat on the couch to glow of the security feed. Flickering across his face, Maya stood by the window, watching Greg's house, across the streetlights, turning on and off a pattern she had memorized. She spoke quietly. "They will come tonight." James felt the weight in her words, not fear, but certainty, the calm before justice. A knock broke the stillness, firm, deliberate. 3 times James glanced at her. She nodded and walked to the door. Greg stood there, flanked by Brent and Collins. Brent's grin, wider than ever. "Evening. Mrs. Carter, we need to discuss some complaints," he said, his tone smug, as if this was another casual humiliation. Greg held a file, pretending authority. "This can go easy or hard." Maya stepped aside and said, "Come," in her voice smooth like glass. Brent entered, first scanning the room, unaware of the small camera. Hidden in the corner, James stood near the hallway, silent, watchful. Greg began his speech about violations, about attitude, about community standards. Maya listened, her eyes unreadable. Brent leaned against the wall, arms folded, confidence dripping like oil. Collins laughed under his breath until Maya spoke, every word sharp as a blade. "Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming. It saved me the trouble of finding you." Greg frowned, not understanding. Brent smirked. "Yes, sure, you're welcome." She pressed a button on her phone. The television screen behind them flickered to life, showing their own faces from the live camera feed, audio crackling as Brent's voice played from an earlier recording. "Keep your wife's temper in check." The color drained from Brent's face. Collins stepped forward, stammering. "What is this?" Maya said. "Evidence you've been under investigation for abuse of authority, coercion, and misconduct." Greg's jaw tightened. "You can't do this. You're just a homeowner." She turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Not just a homeowner. I'm the district attorney of this county. And you, Greg, have been financing illegal intimidation through HOA funds." Outside, faint sirens began to build in the distance. Brent moved suddenly, trying to grab her phone, but James stepped between them, his stance firm, not angry, just immovable. Brent hesitated, and for the first time his confidence cracked through the window. Red and blue lights washed over the living room. Greg turned pale, Maya's voice calm. "But merciless gentlemen, meet Detective Ortiz." The door opened, and Ortiz stepped in. Badge-raised officers behind her. Brent and Collins froze as she read their rights. Greg tried to speak, but words stumbled out like broken glass. "This is a mistake." Maya watched as they were cuffed. Brent's face twisted with disbelief. "This is a setup." She said, "No, this is accountability." Greg's clipboard fell from his hand, papers scattering across the floor like fallen lies. The neighbors began to peek through their curtains, whispers spreading like wildfire. James recorded everything, his hand steady, his breath. Even Ortiz escorted the men outside, the flashing lights painting their shame across every window. Maya followed to the porch, the night air cool on her skin. She looked at Greg as he was led to patrol car, his eyes pleading, desperate. She said softly, "Power doesn't make you untouchable. It only makes your fall louder." He turned away as the door shut. The siren wailed, slicing through the stillness. Days past, headlines erupted across town. HOA president arrested in suburban corruption scandal. 2 officers suspended pending charges. Of footage went viral, shared by thousands. A story of arrogance meeting justice. Neighbors stopped James and Maya on walks, offering apologies and cautious smiles. The street that once watched them with suspicion now looked at them with quiet respect. One evening, James grilled on the patio, smoke curling into the calm sky. He said, "You could have done it quietly." She smiled, the kind of smile that carried both warmth and warning. "Silence protects power. Exposure ends it." He nodded. Maybe that's why they never saw it coming. She took a sip of tea, the fading sun casting gold on her face. For the first time in weeks, peace didn't feel fragile. Across the street, a for sale sign leaned crooked in Greg's lawn, his house empty. Now the once perfect yard overgrown. The sound of cicadas hummed like distant applause. James looked at Maya and said, "Remind me never to make you mad." She laughed softly. "Too late. You already did when you burned dinner again." He grinned, raising his hands in surrender. Guilty. She touched his arm, her voice quiet. "But steady, we fought for respect, not revenge, and that's what makes a victory." As the sky deepened into violet, James watched her eyes, catching the last light of day. He thought of how strength sometimes looked like stillness and justice sometimes like patience. He whispered, "You're incredible." She turned toward him, the faintest smile playing at her lips. "Not incredible," she said, "just done being quiet." The night settled around them, gentle and final. And for the first time since it began, everything felt right again.